my relationship with Elvis Presley is based on friendship. The job comes second. If I would have known in 75, early 76, that we were going to lose Elvis, I would not have left.
Fame made Elvis Presley a legend. But in his final years, he revealed confessions to his closest friend, Jerry Schilling, that the world never heard. These are not tabloid tales or exaggerated rumors, but the words of a man grappling with love, regret, faith, and mortality. To Jerry, Elvis was more than a superstar. He was a friend, a dreamer, and a man struggling under the weight of his own legend. These truths, only spoken in private, remained hidden for decades. Now, through Jerry's eyes, we uncover them. This is not the story of Elvis Presley, the icon, but Elvis the man. And these are his true confessions people should finally know. A Bond Before the Crown. Memphis, 1954. Jerry Schilling was a 12-year-old boy spending time at Guthrie Park, where he often played pickup football. During one of these games, a teenager joined the group, someone Jerry immediately recognized from the radio. The teenager was Elvis Presley, fresh from recording his first single, That's All Right. At this early stage, Elvis was not yet a superstar. He was known only to a few, still a local figure, and not yet a legend. Jerry remembers the encounter not as an introduction to fame, but as the moment he met a friend. He emphasizes that the meeting was the beginning of a personal relationship, not the launch of a celebrity. As Jerry puts it decades later, it's time to tell everything. That day wasn't the beginning of Elvis the superstar. It was the beginning of Elvis, the friend. And for me, it was the beginning of 23 years of seeing the man behind the legend. This friendship was grounded in the ordinary, shared games, simple moments, and mutual trust. But the ordinary would soon become extraordinary. Over the years, Elvis would come to rely on Jerry not only for companionship, but as the one person he could speak to when the pressures of fame became unbearable. The boy Jerry met in the park would one day be the man who confessed his deepest regrets, fears, and longings in private conversations Jerry never forgot. That first meeting, witnessed by only a handful of boys, marked the start of a lifelong bond, one strong enough to carry the weight of secrets Elvis would never share with the public, confessions Jerry now believes the world deserves to hear. The charisma and the kindness. From the very start, Elvis radiated a rare gravitational pull. Even on the football field, Jerry saw it in the way he darted between defenders, uncoached, unschooled, but magnetic all the same. That energy didn't dissipate when the game ended. Instead, it seemed to multiply, finding new expressions. In the late-night movie screenings that Elvis rented out for just his friends, in the joyrides through Memphis with the radio turned up and the windows down, in the spontaneous invitations to amusement parks cleared out for a private midnight thrill. To be close to Elvis, Jerry recalls, was to live in the orbit of something extraordinary, but not always explainable. Elvis's generosity was legendary even before the world could name it. Jerry remembers houses bought and given away without fanfare, cars pressed into friends' hands after a single wistful comment, hospital bills settled before families even knew they needed help. The money was never the story, though. It was the instinct to protect, to uplift, to make the world softer for those he let inside his walls. But behind closed doors, Elvis admitted that generosity came with a cost. Each gift was both an act of kindness and a shield, a way of proving his worth to a world that often misunderstood him. He confessed quietly to Jerry that no matter how much he gave, it never stopped the loneliness, or the feeling that people wanted the rhinestones and Cadillacs, but rarely the man himself. "Jerry, people see the rhinestones and the Cadillac," he said once, exhaustion woven into every word, "but they don't see the boy who's just trying to live up to all of it." It was one of many moments where Elvis's smile faded and the truth surfaced. Kindness wasn't always enough to protect him from being misread, misused, or misunderstood. These weren't words for the public or for posterity. These were the secret confessions reserved for a friend who had been there since the beginning, someone Elvis trusted to carry the weight of the truths he couldn't share with the world. The Hollywood Trap. Elvis Presley's time in Hollywood was marked not by artistic triumph, but by deep frustration and a growing sense of loss. The films he starred in were produced rapidly, with a focus on commercial viability rather than creative quality. Jerry Schilling, a close friend and confidant, remembers how Elvis would often sit in silence watching his own films, his face clouded with discontent. He wasn't proud of what he saw, the music, the scripts, the performances. They felt like chains rather than opportunities. I hated most of those songs, Jer. They put me in a box, lied to me, threatened me, said if I didn't do the songs, I'd lose the picture. These weren't offhand grumbles. They were private confessions from Elvis that revealed how powerless he had become in his own career. The system dictated what he sang, what he wore, how he moved. Behind this trap was a tightly controlled business structure that prioritized profit over artistry. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, orchestrated deals that demanded songwriters to give up significant portions of their royalties or risk being shut out. Unless they agreed, Elvis was never even allowed to consider their work. "They cut me off from the real music," Elvis admitted. To Jerry, it wasn't just a complaint about contracts. It was Elvis confessing the pain of being locked away from the art that had once defined his soul. Hollywood had turned him into a product. The roles were repetitive, the storylines predictable. His image was molded to fit a safe and sellable template. With each film, Elvis told Jerry he felt a little more of himself slipping away, as though the man was being replaced by the brand. He felt robbed of time, of identity, of legacy. "I see those movies, Jer, and I hardly recognize myself anymore." For Jerry, these weren't just casual complaints of a star unhappy with his career. They were quiet confessions from a man who once revolutionized music, but now felt discarded by the very machine that had elevated him. They were whispered truths from a man who feared the world would never know the real Elvis. The Hollywood years weren't just a detour. They were a prison disguised as an opportunity. Confessions of the heart. In the privacy of Graceland's den, long after the world outside had gone to sleep, Elvis's guard would finally drop. It was during one of these late-night conversations that Elvis admitted the truth about his marriage to Priscilla. He sat beside Jerry, the room heavy with the silence of unspoken thoughts, then finally spoke. "We've just grown apart. We don't want the same things anymore." There was no anger in his voice, just sadness, an exhaustion that came from trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. Jerry remembers that moment with clarity, because it wasn't tabloid fodder or dramatic scandal. It was heartbreak, whispered in confidence, a confession Elvis would never risk saying in public. Elvis still loved Priscilla, and he adored Lisa Marie, his daughter. But in private, he admitted that love was sometimes not enough to keep two people moving in the same direction. The world saw only the glamorous couple, the glittering wedding, and the photographs of domestic bliss. But Jerry carried a different truth, the quiet, unguarded words of a man who could not live up to the image that had been built around him. Elvis wasn't perfect, but he was honest with me in ways that he couldn't be with anyone else, and I carry that truth because he trusted me with it. For Jerry, these late-night admissions were the essence of his friendship with Elvis, a bond forged not by fame or fortune, but by a willingness to be vulnerable when the world was not watching. It is this honesty, Jerry suggests, that reveals the man behind the legend. A man shaped by disappointment and longing, but also by a rare and enduring trust. I've got to get back to who I am. In the months leading up to the 1968 television special that would later be called the Comeback Special, Elvis Presley was in a critical place, both personally and artistically. For years, he had been churning out movie after movie, films that were often commercially successful but creatively stifling. Many of them followed the same predictable formulas, with forgettable soundtracks that Elvis himself admitted he had little passion for. The films had slowly eroded his confidence, turning one of music's most groundbreaking performers into a reluctant Hollywood puppet. As rehearsals began for the NBC special, Jerry Schilling was by Elvis's side, as he had been for years. During a quiet moment amid the setup, Elvis turned to Jerry and said something that struck him with raw force. "Jer, I've got to get back to who I really am. I've been lost in those movies. If I don't do this, it's over. This wasn't just a dramatic moment. It was the naked admission of a man who feared he had lost himself and who saw this one chance as his lifeline. For Jerry, the words weren't just about returning to music. They were about reclaiming identity, integrity, and purpose. By this time, Elvis's public image had been polished to a fault. The gritty, soulful performer who had changed the sound of popular music in the 1950s had been buried beneath layers of Hollywood contracts, Colonel Parker's iron grip, and a manufactured persona that Elvis no longer recognized. He had spent much of the 1960s feeling boxed in, increasingly alienated from the music that once gave him life. To Jerry, that single sentence wasn't about television ratings. It was Elvis admitting that his identity, his art, and even his spirit were at stake. The comeback special represented a rare opportunity. For the first time in years, Elvis was being given a stage, a live audience, and the chance to perform on his own terms. Under the guidance of director Steve Binder and music producer Bones Howe, both of whom pushed for rawness, authenticity, and a break from the standard TV variety format, Elvis had the freedom to dig deep. And he did. The rehearsal sessions confirmed it. Elvis didn't treat them like practice. He treated them like a fight for survival. Elvis sat on a small platform surrounded by his original bandmates, Scotty Moore and DJ Fontana among them, holding his guitar, drenched in sweat, working through old songs not as nostalgic throwbacks, but as lifelines. He approached them with urgency and desperation. Jerry could see it in the way he clutched the instrument, the way he paused between verses, as if trying to remember something lost, not a lyric, but a version of himself that had been buried under a decade of compromise. What emerged in those sessions wasn't polished, but it was powerful. The music was loose, fiery, and unrehearsed. Elvis cracked jokes, told stories, and sang with a force that hadn't been seen in years. The crew, including Jerry, knew something unusual was happening. This wasn't just television. This was a reclamation. This was Elvis confessing to the world, through music, that he had been lost and was desperate to be found again. When the special aired in December 1968, it didn't just boost ratings, it electrified the public. Viewers saw a version of Elvis they hadn't witnessed in over a decade, vulnerable yet commanding, playful yet serious, nostalgic yet fiercely present. Critics hailed it as a rebirth, but for those who were there, including Jerry, it was something more personal. It was a confession, a breakthrough, and a statement of defiance. Jerry later said that during that special, he didn't see the movie star or the idol. He saw Elvis Presley, the kid from Memphis who used to sit around and play gospel and blues just for the love of it. He looked around and grinned, Jerry remembered. And for a moment, the old Elvis was back. Not the myth, not the product, but the man. The 1968 comeback special didn't just restore Elvis's career, it reconnected him to his soul. And for Jerry, that moment marked a turning point, one where everything wasn't just for the audience. It was for Elvis himself. His life was not entertainment for entertainment's sake. It was survival, boundaries and apologies. But not all confessions were so redemptive or so easy to witness. Jerry remembers one night with a sting he never quite shook. There had been a heated argument between Elvis and Priscilla, and Jerry, who always tried to be the peacemaker, had spoken softly to her afterward, hoping to soothe her nerves. But Elvis, catching wind of this, turned on Jerry with a suddenness that stunned them both. "Don't you ever speak to her behind my back." The words were sharp, laced with an anger that was less about betrayal and more about a wound, something old and festering. In that moment, Jerry felt the full weight of Elvis's trust and how quickly it could shatter. Their friendship had always felt unbreakable, but that accusation made Jerry question everything. The room fell cold, and for the first time, the bond between them seemed painfully fragile. Jerry kept his distance the rest of the night, the echo of Elvis's outburst hanging over him. But later, in the hush of early morning, Elvis found Jerry alone. His voice was low and uncertain, stripped of its usual bravado. "Jer, I was wrong. I'm sorry. I went too far." It wasn't easy for Elvis to apologize. Jerry could see the struggle in his eyes, the battle between pride and regret. But he meant every word. And in that apology, Jerry saw not the king of rock and roll, but the man behind the myth, a man capable of insecurity, of lashing out, and most importantly, of recognizing his faults and seeking forgiveness. Jerry understood then that true friendship is built not only on shared triumphs, but also on weathering these moments of hurt and humility together. "It's time to tell everything," Jerry says, the phrase a promise to honor the whole truth, not just the golden legend, but the complicated, vulnerable man who could make mistakes and admit them. The dreams that died. Elvis had long wanted to prove he was more than just a music icon. Watching A Star Is Born stirred a quiet ache in him. Jerry Schilling remembers him watching the preview and saying, "That should have been me, Jer. I could have done that picture with Barbara. I could have shown the world I was more than just rock and roll." It wasn't just a casual observation. It was a direct acknowledgement of a missed opportunity that never stopped haunting him. He had the acting talent, the screen presence, and a genuine desire to evolve beyond his image, but the opportunity slipped through his fingers. Beyond acting roles, Elvis had creative ambitions that stretched much further. He talked frequently about producing films and documentaries that would reveal the deeper layers of his life, his struggles, and his philosophies. One recurring dream was a serious project centered on his devotion to martial arts. He saw film not just as a stage, but as a platform for truth, growth, and legacy. He even formed Elvis Presley Enterprises Films with the hope of bringing these visions to life. But none of it moved forward. Every step toward independence was met with resistance from management, whose priority remained profit over passion. Colonel Tom Parker, always concerned with short-term revenue, dismissed anything that didn't guarantee a commercial return. Jerry recalls how the bureaucracy and fear of risk constantly shut Elvis down, and it wore him out. "They won't let me grow. And I'm tired of being boxed in." That's what he told Jerry, not in anger, but in exhaustion. Elvis's dreams weren't abstract fantasies. They were real, outlined, and ready for execution. But every time a new door seemed possible, it was quietly closed. The cost of his fame was limited. The man who once defied boundaries on stage now faced creative walls that grew higher with each passing year. And Jerry watched it all. He saw how Elvis's enthusiasm would rise when he spoke of something new, then dim just as quickly when reality reasserted itself. In the end, those dreams didn't collapse in a dramatic moment. They just faded. No spotlight, no grand goodbye, just silence, the gospel of his soul. When all the trappings of fame were stripped away, when there were no spotlights, no gold records lining the walls, and no crowds roaring his name, what was left was the sound of gospel. For Jerry, this was Elvis's deepest confession, the truth he could never fully say, but always sang. Gospel was more than a genre. It was a lifeline, a secret refuge where he could pour out everything he couldn't express to the world. Jerry recalls the night Elvis stepped into the studio to record How Great Thou Art. It wasn't the glitzy Vegas showman that entered that room, but a man stripped bare, trembling with the intensity of what he was about to sing. The music started, and Jerry watched as Elvis gave himself to it completely, every note rising from some place too private for words. He sang until his face went pale, until his knees shook beneath him. At the final chorus, he dropped to the floor, exhausted, a faint smile breaking through the sweat and strain. Later, when the studio had emptied and the world had shrunk back down to just the two of them, Elvis tried to explain what moments like that meant. "That's what it's all about, Jer. Not the money, not the movies. There was a rawness in his eyes, the kind that only comes from telling the absolute truth. For Jerry, his voice is how he remembers Elvis most vividly, not as a king or an icon, but as a soul still searching, finding peace only in the songs that let him confess everything he couldn't say out loud. In those moments, the boundaries fell away, and for a little while, Elvis was free." The final confessions. By the mid-1970s, Jerry watched a subtle but unmistakable change take hold of Elvis. The energy that once electrified stadiums and studios had begun to fade. replaced by a persistent fatigue that no amount of applause could cure. The road was no longer a stage for reinvention, but a gauntlet, each tour a little harder to recover from, each night's sleep a little shorter. Jerry saw how the pressures of expectation pressed down on Elvis's shoulders. The circle of trust, once full of laughter and late-night talk, had shrunk to a handful of loyal friends. There were nights when Graceland felt less like a refuge and more like a gilded cage, a place where the weight of memory and responsibility was inescapable. One night, as the world outside buzzed with anticipation for another show, Elvis sat across from Jerry, the silence heavy in the room. There was no ceremony in the confession, only the quiet exhaustion of a man who had carried too much for too long. "I don't know how much longer I've got. I'm tired, Jer. I'm just so tired." The words were simple, but Jerry knew what Elvis was telling him, that the well of energy that had sustained him for years was running dry, that beneath the glitter and the bravado was a man keenly aware of his own mortality. It was a moment of vulnerability that Jerry never forgot, a raw acknowledgement that time was closing in, and that the relentless demands of the world would not ease, not even at the end. There was no dramatic gesture, no theatrical collapse. Instead, it was the honest voice of a friend speaking plainly to another, afraid of what the next day would bring. Jerry recognized in that moment how much Elvis feared not just for his health, but for the way he would be remembered, for the things left unsaid and the dreams left unfinished. The legacy he wanted known. The final word on Elvis Presley, as Jerry Schilling presents it, is not a polished myth or a media-friendly image. It's a human truth. It was not recorded in journals or captured in documentaries, but rather it was spoken quietly, in confidence, over decades. Elvis never wrote down his confessions. He spoke them to the ones he trusted. He told me about his regrets, his fears, his faith, his mistakes, and his dreams that never came true. His story wasn't about preserving the legend, it was about preserving the man. Jerry makes it clear, what he shares isn't secondhand gossip or recycled tabloid material. It's not constructed by outsiders looking in. These are the first-hand truths, the vulnerable, unsanitized memories entrusted to someone who stood beside Elvis through it all. And now, it's time to tell everything. Not the tabloid stories, not the myths, but the truth that Elvis wanted to be remembered for. That truth is layered. Elvis was not one thing. He was not only generous or troubled. He was both. Jerry doesn't gloss over the contradictions. He names them. Elvis could light up a room and disappear inside himself on the same day. He could give with breathtaking generosity and still lash out when afraid. He chased meaning in music, in God, and in fame, and sometimes lost himself in all three. He was generous, he was flawed, he was brilliant, and he was human. And that, more than anything else, is the confession of Elvis Presley. This closing sentiment isn't crafted for drama. It's the weight of memory being lifted. Jerry doesn't speak like a man polishing a eulogy. He speaks like a friend honoring a promise. Elvis wanted to be known for who he really was, not just the icon in rhinestones. And through Jerry's words, he finally is. These are the truths Elvis only dared to confess in private. Truths people should finally know. Jerry's memories open a window into Elvis's deepest truths. But what about you? What do you think Elvis truly wanted the world to remember about him, his music, his generosity, or his unspoken regrets? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching this video with us, and catch you in the next one.